Hi everyone, I hope you are all doing well and are in good health. My presentation is going to be about the Project for a New American Century, in short PNAC, and its approach to the Middle East. So to provide some context, neoconservatism is a right-wing American political ideology that has democracy and capitalism as its core values, and therefore its followers believe in expanding these values beyond American borders by any means necessary. According to Stephen Eric Bronner, neoconservatism, quote, can be identified with a small network of influential intellectuals and friends whose thinking originated in the Anti-Communist Committee on the Present Danger of 1950, which in 1997 made way for the Project for a New American Century, end quote. Furthermore, a group of working-class Jewish American intellectuals in New York, among whom were Irving Kristol, reflected on the university riots of the late 1960s by blaming it on liberalism. Neoconservative ideologies blended into the domestic American political sphere and later found its way to its foreign policy. Stephen McGlinchey argued that Irving Kristol describes three central pillars to an American foreign policy should have 1. A strong sense of patriotism, 2. A round rejection of anything resembling or pointing towards a world government, including round rejection of the UN and NATO, and finally the view that statesmen should clearly distinguish friends from enemies. Stephen McGlinchey argues that it is the neoconservative approach that potentially shaped Bush's administration. So to begin by talking about the organization and who founded it, the PNAC is, quote, a non-profit educational organization whose goal is to promote American global leadership, end quote, according to the very short description about the PNAC on their website. Moving on to the actual description of this neoconservative organization, the PNAC was established in 1997 by co-founder and chairman William Kristol and Robert Kagan, the former being a former Republican that strongly advocated for a U.S. invasion of Iraq during the Clinton administration. PNAC's members had strong administrative positions in the government, allowing it to have a high influence on the high-level U.S. state officials as well as the Bush administration, which essentially led to the administration's development of the Bush Doctrine and its military and foreign policies, with a great focus on a war with Iraq. In his article on the PNAC, William Rivers Pitt argues that two events placed the PNAC on top of the list of the advisors to the American government: George W. Bush's election and 9/11. After Bush won the elections, he gave every PNAC member a position either in the Pentagon, the Defense Department, or the White House. The U.S. government essentially embodied an anti-Iraq rhetoric. PNAC made its first public appearance with the issuance of their Statement of Principles on June 3, 1997. It was signed by both co-founders as well as other neoconservative officials. The statement begins by stating the shortcomings of the previous Clinton administration, such as, quote, they have not fought for a defense budget that would maintain American security and advance American interests in the new century, end quote. It then goes on to pose a series of questions about America's readiness to basically rule the world, having just come out of the Cold War victorious. The document then addresses these questions in a series of requirements that need to be met in order to maximize America's interests. Quote, we need to increase defense spending significantly if we are to carry out global responsibilities today and modernize our armed forces for the future. We need to strengthen our ties to democratic allies and to challenge regimes hostile to our interests and values. We need to promote the cause of political and economic freedom abroad. And we need to accept responsibility for America's unique role in preserving and extending an international order friendly to our security, our prosperity, and our principles, end quote. Interestingly, the statement acknowledges that, quote, such a Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity may not be fashionable today, but it is necessary if the U.S. is to build on the successes of this past century and to ensure our security and our greatness in the next, end quote. Which is important to note, as we will see later, the PNAC knew their mission was going to receive backlash and opposition, however, framing it in a way that put American interests at its core blinded the Americans. A regime change in Iraq was adamantly a predominant goal for the PNAC. Some background on the PNAC members: Richard Pearl, who was another key member of the PNAC, wrote a report in 1996 proposing regime changes in an attempt to restructure power in the Middle East, and specifically called for removing Saddam Hussein in Iraq. It is important to note that the report was given to Israel's Netanyahu as some members of the PNAC, such as Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith, actually worked for Netanyahu in Israel earlier. These same people put out intense nationalism and militarism at the heart of the PNAC. Later in 1998, Pearl, Wolfowitz, John Bolton, and other key PNAC members signed a letter sent to Bill Clinton that basically called for the removal of Saddam. Clinton agreed with their stance, however, it was sanctioned by the UN. The PNAC also supported the Iraqi Liberation Act of 1998, which Clinton signed into law. Upon Iraq's rejection and lack of cooperation with UN weapons inspections, the PNAC drafted a letter to Clinton, urging the president to remove Saddam by using military power, saying that Iraq poses a threat to the US and its Middle Eastern allies, as well as American oil resources. The US insisted that Saddam owns weapons of mass destruction. The PNAC argued that Iraq's failure to abide by UN's regulations and its indifference to the sanctions imposed on its economy provides a legitimate basis for the US to launch its attack on Iraq's soil. Crystal wrote in his online magazine, The Weekly Standard, that PNAC's goal is to create, quote, a liberated zone in southern Iraq that would provide a safe haven where opponents of Saddam could rally and organize a credible alternative to the present regime. The liberated zone would have to be protected by the US military might, both from the air and, if necessary, on the ground, end quote. In 1999, however, the PNAC criticized the December 1998 bombing of Iraq and Operation Desert Fox for being ineffective and questioned whether the support for Iraqi democratic opposition was necessary. The PNAC argued that containment policy is a lost cause, meaning a more militarized action needs to take place. Thus, in September 2000, we witnessed the birth of PNAC's most controversial publication yet, entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses: Strategies, Forces, and Resources for a New Century. The PNAC cemented the message that, quote, American leadership is good for both America and the world, end quote, and supported a, quote, Reaganite policy of military strength and moral clarity, end quote, where an increase in military spending and budget was America's top priority. PNAC's Rebuilding America's Defenses report further institutionalized and brought to life plans and ideologies upheld for so long by the American government. The report argues that, quote, the American peace has proven itself peaceful, stable, and durable. It has over the past decade provided the geopolitical framework for widespread economic growth and the spread of American principles of liberty and democracy. Yet no moment in international politics can be frozen in time. Even a global Pax Americana will not preserve itself, end quote. The report advocated for a much larger military interference, the ability to fight multiple simultaneous wars, and an aggressive agenda for going after nations residing in regions specific to American interests, such as resource regions like Iraq and its oil. The language of the report is about absolute dominance and establishment of a world order that combats any potential rival. The US, having essentially won the Cold War, has no new enemies now, and looking at post-9/11 US, terrorism seems to be its new enemy. Through this new enemy, terrorism, which we have yet to see it move away from a rhetoric to an actual event, post-9/11 of course, America expands its superpower agenda and fulfills the world's unipolar dynamics. The report is essentially a way for the US to mold the global order and security system to fit its own interests and in a way that places its interests above the rest of the world. At its core, the report has 4 missions for the US military: defend the American homeland, 2. Fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars, 3. Perform the constabulary duties associated with shaping the security environment in critical regions, and 4. Transform U.S. forces to exploit the revolution in military affairs. It is also stated that the mission is attainable once the U.S. A. maintains nuclear strategic superiority, B. restores their personnel strength, C. repositions U.S. forces to respond to 21st century strategic realities by shifting permanently based forces to Southeast Europe and Southeast Asia, and by changing naval deployment patterns to reflect growing U.S. strategic concerns in East Asia. This is important to note as we see the U.S. military bases surrounding its enemies. The countless military bases around Iran is an interesting one, as its borders are constantly threatened by the US. This is America's attempt at countering terrorism. But who's really being threatened here? Knowing it will not win the public's vote if they were to maintain the language of the former national security proposal of the Wolfowitz Doctrine, these hardline neoconservatives took it to the Rebuilding America's Defense report to argue that, quote, the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor. This essentially set the stage for 9/11 and paved the way for countless US justifications on a war on Iraq. On September 20, 2001, 9 days after the September 11 attacks, the PNAC sent a letter to President George W. Bush advocating, quote, a determined effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, or regime change even if evidence does not link Iraq directly to the attack. Any strategy aiming at the eradication of terrorism and its sponsors must include a determined effort to remove Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq, end quote. This somehow suddenly seemed very convenient when a 2001 report on US energy security and it facing an unprecedented energy price volatility came out. In short, the US was desperate for Iraqi oil. In March 2003, the US invades Iraq. This preemptive strike ran over accusations such as A. Saddam was involved in the 9/11 attacks, B. It owned weapons of mass destruction, and C. It had ties with Al-Qaeda. Iraq becomes part of a larger project that involves the US strengthening its foothold in the Middle East through its military bases and ensuring that the oil resources flow into its economy. This neoconservative organization believed in the invasion of Iraq and saw it as an opportunity to solidify American hegemony in the region. To end my presentation, I'd like to draw your attention to this song called The Project for a New American Century by Anti-Flag. The band is well known for its politically motivated messages and activism, focusing on human rights and different left-wing causes. The messages being conveyed in the song are so interesting and powerful, and the lyrics is quite dark. The link will be provided along with the link to my presentation. I am interested to read your comments, and I look forward to discussing them with you. Thank you.